first of all, the Westborough Historic Society thanks you all for coming out. We were taking a gamble, and it, I guess, paid off. So I have 7 layers. Anyone can be at more than 7 layers to keep yourself warm today. Okay, so first of all, this is the first of the walking tours. We're mixing architecture and music, and we have special guests, hopefully on all 11 tours from now to November. So my name's Chris Noonan. I have a master's in historic preservation. Done a whole lot of these sort of things. They're supposed to be fun. So what I would say, if the weather seems to be biting on someone, don't feel, if you have to step out, get warm in the car. We are going to have 2 interior stops. One is at the Westborough Savings Bank. Who's the next Westborough Savings Bank depositor? Anyone? Hey, okay, we got a few. Good, okay. And then we're going to go to Sakihana's, and we're going to have some appetizers. You're more than welcome on your own to go beyond that. And so that'll be, so hopefully there'll be 2 spots where we can pick up some more. I'm here today with my life partner, Luann Crosby. She's a singer-songwriter. As some of you know, she actually wrote the song for the 300th anniversary, which she'll play in the bank where it's warm. If anyone sings, they know, and plays, they know that cold weather and instruments, including the human voice, do not interact very well at all. And then the third thing is Tony Vaver's graciously given us his time. He's the Westborough Room librarian / archivist. He knows his stuff when it comes to library sciences. And part of what he and I are hopefully going to transmit today is that most of what we're teaching and sharing come because a lot of other people have done a lot of work. Everything from the Historic Commission to people like Chris Allen, who's written a really wonderful Westborough history, to primary sources from map makers. And so whether it's your own property or whether you're trying to understand how communities evolve, then this becomes sort of the grist for what your understanding should be. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Tony for a few moments.
As Chris said, I'm the local history librarian here at the library. And then as an added bonus for that, I'm going to give you an insight into the meaning of life. So it's worth that's worth the price of admission right there.
So just another reminder, most everything we're working with today and what Tony was just explaining is these are all called open source documents. Things like copyrights, they're just like patents. When you have written material, maps, images, sometimes there is ownership and sometimes there isn't. And the fact is, there is in the world of the internet and the digital age, there's an awful lot of material that basically is open source, meaning you can use it for whatever you want. We do suggest, you'll notice in the maps that we put in, we just took small excerpts of just the main street from 1830s to 1898, but we also gave note to which maps they came from in the year, so there's some reference point to that. So the other thing, to start us off, I want you to close your eyes for a moment and think we're living at some point between 1700s and the 1800s here in Westborough. So a little bit before we become a town in 1717 and a little bit after. In the world, meaning in the world as defined by Western civilization, in Europe and in North America, the largest city is London, 600,000 people. Here in the US, we have roughly 500,000 people. Of the 500,000 people, over half are slaves. People that were brought from Africa to work as part of the mostly South culture, but also you can find slavery in Philadelphia, Newport, Boston. Another part, and I should also backstep, most of this comes from, Tony wrote 2 great books. So if anyone likes colonial history, or is a historian, either by vocation or avocation, these are really insightful books. And most of these stats about who was actually living here during this colonial period are pretty fascinating. On top of the 50% that are slaves, another 50,000 were just free people. What we would think should be most of that 500,000 group. Another 100,000 were indentured servants, meaning they came here, but they basically owed someone something to get them here, and so therefore they had to pay off a debt. And then finally, another 52,000 were criminals. Now, if you read Tony's books and you see what some people would be accused of for violating crime and law, and you think about it in today's context, it just mostly seems ludicrous, but in the day that was the law within England, but those people were easily transferred here. So where we're going to go here is we're going to deal more with the religious, the Puritans and the religious dissenters, the people that came to the United States from Jamestown, all the way up to Plymouth, Mass, because they weren't really accepting of the English church and its teaching. So let's go over to the corner of Church Street.
Come to the church in the wildwood. Come to the church in the vale. No church is so dear to my childhood as the little brown church in the vale. Come to the church in the wildwood. Come to the church in the vale. No church is so dear to my childhood as the little brown church in the vale. Come, 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 come.
What I want you to do is open up your books to the first map, an 1830s map. It's really hard in most of New England to find maps much earlier that actually show building. There are surely maps that show boundaries, as we saw in Leslie's presentation the other day. There's surely maps that sometimes even give the signatory position of one building. But this for Westborough is actually sort of the first map you can have access to. I believe it's digitized both at the library, and I know we ourselves, LC and I, we actually have a copy at home if everyone needs it. It's an easy thing to email someone. But what you notice is, does everyone sort of see where Main Street is?
Yeah, right here.
Basically, everyone take a few moments, sort of reorientate yourself. The top of the map is sort of up here. It's on the north side. What I call north, not completely compass north. And West Main Street, you see the church?
Yeah.
Okay, this is the ES Meeting Church. Well, the ES is Evangelical Society. So it wasn't really called the Congo Church. Now what happened was, if you turn we're going to flip back and forth a little bit. If you turn to the second page, what you'll see is a picture that comes out of the archives for the library, and it's what is termed the old meeting house. Now the fact of the matter is, this is at the corner where the arcade. Does everyone know where the arcade building is? Right off the Rotary. Okay, so this is this building. If you look at the map, the map we were just on, shows that this is a meeting house. Now the fact is, this picture is much, much later. This picture is probably closer to the late 1800s. And if you look very close, you can see this commercial activity going on. So what I did was, I took one of our early projects, which was the Chestnut Hill Meeting House. This is in Millville. If anyone wants to visit this is primary research. This is actually Mendon's second meeting house, which today is in Millville. It exists, it has no electricity, has no plumbing, has no heat. What you're looking at is a simple Georgian meeting house. This is mostly what you would have found from the 1640s up till you got closer to the 1800s. And you see it's just basically, it looks like a house almost, except for it's fairly large. If you look at the lower pictures, you see the typical pews that we hear so often about how people raise money in order to build these structures. And most importantly, if you look really close, you'll see all this marbleizing and graining. So I don't know if anyone's here out of the fine arts world, but this is basically pine, first period pine, and someone has literally made it look like marble and literally made it look like mahogany. So it gave the inference of a more established thing. So this is where people went to church. It's also where town government happened. This was a shared sort of responsibility. By the time we get to the 1830s, when we see the Congo Church we see here being built, and 20 years later, the UU Church, what we have is the state of Massachusetts, and others followed, basically made a legislative law that says we're going to separate church and state. And so what you had in these Main Street areas is this explosion of churches, in the way we think of churches, with a full spire, and also town halls. So you'll see a lot of town halls built in the 30s, 1830s, 1840s. And that was the reason, because the state said, we want to separate these two things. It also becomes sort of the beginning catalyst for the miracle of Main Street, because what it does now is allow Main Street to not only hold those two institutions, but also start becoming more commercialized. And we'll see some of that as we walk down. The other two major things about the 1830s is one, public education comes to Massachusetts. It's mandated that public education has to be provided to in all communities for students. And the third thing is a major technological change, and that is the railroad, which we will see at the end of this walk, comes in and radically changes how West Main Street works and how East Main Street works. We'll visit the East Main Street sometime. I think it's in Westborough on the Move. I think it's in the end of July or something. So here what we see is, so this is a building that not only was it built in the 1830s, but this has what most people would consider a village format, meaning if you're far away, you see this 5-tiered tower sitting on this projecting pavilion that's pulled out from the nave. So what happens is most of the church is used for ceremony, religious, and yet for the access internally and for the choirs frequently, these projecting pavilions were built, and these become the ornamental surface for that. So if you actually flip to the next page, this is what I'm talking about, open sources. These are 3 photos that come off the congregational website. I don't know who took these. These are definitely professionally done. But because tall architectural buildings are really hard to photograph without getting a parallax problem. And someone, whoever it is, did a really nice job. The other thing I just want to sort of commend the congregational church to is night lighting. I don't know if anyone lives downtown, but I mean this is a trend that goes all around the world, whether it's bridges or churches or major high-rise buildings. But they have this really nice way of illuminating this architecturally really detailed tower that we're seeing. Now, if we look quickly across the street, because even my hands are already getting cold. We noticed the UU Church was about 1850. If again, you can follow in the sequence of maps, you can see when buildings come in and out. But you notice how everything is simpler. You notice the columns we see that are actually 3/4. They actually are 3-dimensional. They pronounce outside the projecting pavilion. But on the UU Church, they're flattened. Those are what we call pilasters because they're flattened. And then above it, if you take off the tower, what does it look like? Who's been to Athens? Who's been to the Parthenon? Who's been to any one of the Roman sites that are in the Middle East? And so what you see is this sort of, ability to idolize what Greece meant in the 4th, 5th, and 6th century because it's part of the basis for our democracy. But now we see it institutionalized in some of the buildings that people are actually constructing.
Which is why they call it Greek Revival.
Which is why they call it Greek Revival. The other just quick note is if you go up to the base of the tower, you see the wheat shard, which is a symbol of being plentiful or being rich in abundance. Okay, does anyone have, okay.
The Catholic Church, when was that?
Okay, the Catholic Church, this specific Catholic Church, okay, if you go to the 3rd page. This Catholic Church was built in 1920s. It's a replacement from a church before. And if you look at the bottom page of, you see the UU Church and the Second Empire building, the exact same ones we see here. You actually, if you look below, you see the original Catholic Church.
It is different.
And what happened was that church, it was at some point in the 19 20s, it was removed. It's in essence, it's a Queen Anne style building that was built, I believe, in the 1880s or something. And this is the replacement, much more durable. It's masonry. If it's maintained, taken care of, it's fine. After a 100-year cycle, it has its own major issues to deal with. But if you look at these 2 historic photos, some other interesting things. If you look at the top, can you see how the UU Church, which today is white, and white is sort of symbolic of the Greek Revival period, but can you see that it actually has a couple of tones to it? And if we did a chromochronology or paint analysis of that building, what we would do is probably find some light grays, some light blues along with the white, and just the black and white allows you to do that. If you notice something else, what's unusual, when we think about a fountain, so we're on Main Street, we come to a fountain, and today it seems like, why do we have a fountain in the middle of all this traffic? Okay, what's going on in the bottom photo? Someone, anyone?
Horses.
Okay, what's the horse doing?
Drinking,
refreshing itself. Just because we have to remember that when horses were the major form of transportation, whether they were with a carriage, a wagon, or alone, they needed to eat, they needed to drink, and they needed to do other things. And so this becomes a major problem in urban areas, but even in suburban areas, or today's suburban areas, it becomes a complicated issue. Anything else that's interesting about the lower photo? Anyone see something in the lower right?
This one had arches on it in those 2 middle things.
That's true.
And those are gone.
That's right, they're changed. That's correct. How about the lower right? No, good eye. No, see, this is what you're trying to do. You're trying to basically put together a mystery. Even in this tour or any of the other 10 tours, none of this should be sort of taken as blank facts. They're fairly well researched. They're done by people who have a good sense of things. But so much of history is one where it's layering of information, layering of good resources, and then trying to figure out. So part of the point there is, when is this picture taken in relationship to what we see today? And I think one of the issues with some of the pictures in the library's collection, I don't know about the historic, is that they're not always dated. So architecturally, you can look at something and get a sense of 20 years or 30 years. but there's not always dates, and so that becomes a little bit of a hindrance when you're trying to, make this rug of information. All right, so what are some of the things people think about main streets or New England villages? What are some of the other symbolic things? Anybody want to share? Because I don't have a list to rattle off. When you go traveling, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, what's unusual about? Go ahead.
Green.
Inns, okay, places to stay. We're going to see a little bit of that later. Village greens. Now, Westborough doesn't have a formal village green, but Grafton has one of the best commons in the air. Northborough is actually in the process of reestablishing a common that never was there, but will function as this place for civic groups to come together and for ceremonies to happen. Another one?
Cemeteries.
Cemeteries.
Beautiful old houses.
Historic houses. Just another quick note. Under international standards and the Department of Interior and the National Park Service standards, if it exists anymore, I don't know, the 50 years is a magic number. So any one of us who's over 50, we're historic. This is also true for the built environment. It's not only true for buildings, it's true for objects like the fountain, it's true for cemeteries, it's true for anything. So if you grew up in a 1962 ranch, split, Cape, guess what? You grew up today in a historic building because it's part of this huge cultural movement after World War II for housing. So we don't have any first period houses here in Westborough. The first period runs from about 1620 to about 1720. There are, within Massachusetts, about 150. You can go visit these frequently. There is, I can tell you the website to go on Macris and look at these. It's the same thing with the meeting house that we were looking at earlier. There's maybe a dozen to 20 of them left. To experience that, and then think about the church, if you still attend church, and how they're arranged and how they're formatted, tells you a whole lot of what those first 100, 150 years were really like. They're pretty Spartan, and they're pretty ceremonious. A building like in Millville, that chimney you saw, that was from the 1850s. That was for a coal stove, just to provide some warmth, but of course that only heated if you were within like 5 to 10 feet, and everyone up in the pews, everyone in the pulpits, they would end up freezing. So we have some Georgian houses that we'll see later. So in April, we're going to do the Southwest Quadrant. This is the earliest neighborhood. There are about 500 resources downtown. There's basically 4 quadrants with some special issues like Main Street, Cemetery, the transportation, Westborough on the Go. In July, we're going to deal with the whole east. We're going to deal with the Rotary. But here, if we look across, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 residential buildings. I'm going to take out the nice Queen Anne with the original colors that the family restored a couple of years ago, because that's actually a sub-property that was built way back in the 1880s. But if you look at this building, the green building, the white building, and the yellow building, you should see some similarities. And what we're going to talk now quickly about is building typology. So for residential buildings only, if you have a Georgian building, that usually means you have a huge hearth system and chimney in the middle. And if you actually go to the end of Cross Street, the Nathan Fisher, the same person who did that first map, there's a beautiful Georgian house that we will see later in that April walk. And what happens is when you walk in, there's a tight staircase to the top, and there basically there's 4 parlors on the first floor and 4 chambers on the second floor. When you move to the Federal period, you see the original garrison. Who grew up in a garrison here? Colonial garrison. Anyone? Come on. No? Okay, I guess we are really into historian buffs. But when you walk into the center of any one of these 4 buildings, you get a staircase to the right that goes to the second floor, and you have a central hallway. And that central hallway goes right to the back of the building. And then you again have your, what then would be called parlors and chambers. So this actually opened up the floor plan. And if you look, like this building here, the chimneys have been removed. So it's historic, it's within that 1800 to 1830 period. But part of it is it's been heavily rehabbed or remodeled because the chimneys were removed, and that's not it's not trying to make judgment, but it's harder to read the typology when the chimneys are removed. Whereas if you see these sort of, 58? And again, the White House and the Yellow House, you can easily determine where all those chimneys are. And so each one of those tells you they're either federal or they're transitional. So let's walk a little bit. Let's walk the 5th page in. And if you look at these 4 buildings we're talking about, what you'll see these houses underneath the main. So where it says Main Street, if you look below that, you'll see 1, 2, 3, sort of 4 houses in a row. And so what you're also starting to see by the 1850s is people's names start appearing. So then if you cross-index people's names with doing deed research, people's names dealing with primary or secondary, historic resources, now you can start building a story around that property and the people that live there. One thing I will say about all these 11 walks, we're not going to spend a lot of time on social history. It's not that it's not important, it's fascinating, but it's just there's a lot of heavy research to go there, and to be frank, I'm not sure it's an easy connection when it usually to be frank, it bores most people because unless they have that immediate interest about that property, it's just disconnected. Now if we go back over to this property across the street, the other things you want to notice is there's some transitional elements going on, and what transition means is you're taking 2 architectural periods and you're melding them together. It's something that happens an awful lot, both in residential, commercial, and institutional building. You notice how long the first floor windows are?
Yeah.
And that's to allow as much light in as possible. You also notice the chimneys are what's called inboard. So they're not central, so they're not Georgian, but they're inboard, so you can still get the central hallway, but you can also get lots of places for heating. Whether it's wood, later it's coal. The other thing that's a little tricky is, one other thing is if you look at the corners of this house at 58, you'll see, what do we have on the corners of that building?
Plasters.
Plasters! So that tells you that not only is this a federal building, but there's some Greek features in it. So now we're really probably somewhere in the 1830s, 1840s. And then the portico, what you see, just to provide slight confusion, the portico you see in front is actually from the teens and 20s. And what happens is, we have a centennial in 1876, our 100-year thing. 3 things happen around most of the East Coast. Historic societies are founded. Historic societies or groups of interested people buy historic buildings, so it becomes this sort of museum, a nonprofit to the fathers or the mothers before. You have histories written from the 1870s to the 1900s that are sort of this compilation of information, not really well sourced, documented, not a lot of primary referencing. It's not that they don't provide some insight, but when you read those books, you always have to be a little bit careful. There's a lot of opinion that goes into it, rather than actual historical factual. Whereas someone like Chris's book does a really good job about footnoting. Actually, you want to talk about your book real quick?
History that went way back. There was a very good history that was written in 1899 by Bates, and he brought it right up, and there was a lot of the Civil War and early history, but I thought it was important to go back and start at the prehistory, and we had a lot of archaeological work done in Westborough at that time. So it took it from prehistory up to the 1980s and showed how the town really changed, as we're going to be seeing, from a rural town to a hub industry, and then later on it was relatively quiet, and then it started up again with all the high tech. But it's sort of an overview of Westborough from the very earliest.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Books, 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 so many books to read. Books, 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 books for you and me. We go to the library all the time, so many books I think it's fine. Books, 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 so many books to read. Books, 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 books for you and me.
Another really nice thing about Chris's book that you don't always find in more contemporary historic overviews is she goes all the way up to the present, all the way up to the 70s. And the fact is that might seem like a silly notion, but when you think about it, how many years out are we already? We're already 40 years. We're almost at that 10-year mark. And for most of Eastern Massachusetts, the 70s was the beginning of us coming out of really what was a long recession after most of the industry left in the 50s and 60s in the Blackstone Valley, here in the boroughs, and on. So we should think, to Tony's point, about contemporary things having some historic importance, because they do, given enough space and time. So we end up with this great institutional building, the library. The library's in the middle of potentially a major expansion and rehab. If anyone has seen the plans, they're actually posted inside. Personally, I think architecturally and programmatically it works. But what happened with the beginning, which is the main part of the public library, is by the time you get to the turn of the century, we have a middle class. We have a middle class that we're going to see over in the northeast section, High Street, if anyone lives up in the High Street area, and we'll have a little bit on the Church Street. And so what do middle class people do? They do the same thing we do today. We traveled not as extensively. We didn't fly across, but people traveled. And so a lot of times people would go to Europe, and they would go to places like Italy. And so this is the Renaissance, what's called a Renaissance revival stylistically. And the reason is because it's working off the Florence style building where you had three parts. You had a rusticated base, you have this large sort of middle two-story piece with these oversized windows, and then you have some sort of cornice with some sort of parapet trim. The parapet here is missing if you look at the historic photo. In fact, if you look at the historic photo, so go in, I don't know, 5 or 6 pages, I think, something like this. Yeah, the postcards. So the postcards are another great source for information. And guess what? Frequently they're dated because someone sent them and it's either postmarked or someone actually marked the thing. So if you look at this is a color rendering of probably what was fairly true. If you look up at the top of the cornice, meaning the edge of the roof, you notice all that sort of sculpted acanthus leaves and such are all missing. And this is true for most, what happens, buildings are basically boxes, and everything that goes outside the box looks good, is there for a reason. Sometimes it's part of the design initiative, but after time, if it's not maintained and cared for, guess what? It's the first thing to disappear because no one wants to spend the money about what's going on. So I don't know what, I'm not on the library committee, I don't know what's going on here. It'd be really, really interesting and cool if they reestablished that. Now maybe it's not done in sheet metal as it was, but as we will see with the town hall, you use modern materials, but they actually look and feel much the same. So if we reverse ourselves and go back over to the federal building, again, you see in the next two buildings, you see this 5-bay with 3 to 4 bays depth. You see that in this case we have a hip roof, one of the defining features of federal. In the first building we were at 58, you notice that's called a gable roof. But they both have these sort of inboard chimneys. So if we walked in through that federal entryway, so that the elliptical fan light you see is a classic federal feature. You don't find it anywhere else until you come to the Colonial Revival in the 19-teens and 20s. And the side lights only going 3/4 to halfway down. You'd find that big open hallway that would go right through to the back and a staircase going upstairs as long as the original floor plan was intact. Now if you look to the left, to the yellow house, this was a dock. Another important thing about these large sort of buildings from the 1790s to 1850s or so is a lot of times they were used as businesses. So the yellow building was owned by a doctor. He had his practice there. He also, I guess, became a senator. Chris can help me out here. And he was quite influential. He was one of the reasons why the state legislature mandated that all towns had to provide books for free to students here in Massachusetts. So this is frequently what happens. These residential buildings stay residential, but sometimes they take in the home office, as we would call them, whether you're out in suburbia or here on Main Street. What it does allow is it allows people some room and space to basically capitalize and then reinvest back into the building, so they're still here a couple 100 years later. The other thing you'll notice on the yellow building is it has a great outbuilding, a barn. When we do the southwest quadrant in April, we're going to look a lot at outbuildings, because outbuildings are fascinating. They tell us a lot about how we lived for many years. They are also a high casualty rate because frequently we don't use them for anything. And guess what? Any building anywhere in the world that doesn't get used will sooner or later deteriorate under some sort of water, moisture, vaporized system and then just disappear. And so part of it is you always want, whether it's residential, commercial, institutional, to have activity. But one of the things I meant to say back at the Congo Church is, anyone goes to the farmer's market?
Yep.
Is farmer's market part of the village? Is farmer's market part of a main street somewhere? It is. And so this is what's nice about churches or institutional buildings, is they allow for open space and green space so people can come and meet. The other great thing, I was walking our dog Autumn last week at Sunday, which I don't usually for some reason. But anyway, I come up here and usually this is what I see during the week. Lots of traffic and parking. Okay, well, church is there. All these public buildings are empty, and guess what? Everyone's sharing parking. The reverse happens during the week. This is a really important concept. We have to remember, we're all wedded to the vehicle. Westborough on the Move lecture will talk about that. We'll see some early gas stations, some early repair shops. But the fact of the matter is we need to put a place for cars, but we don't want to eliminate all the other physical fabric, meaning streets, sidewalks, green space, buildings, in order to park, because then what? We might as well just go to the mall and live. It's a lot easier. And they have plenty of space. They have acres and acres usually. So somehow, as part of town planning or city planning, you have to deal with a car, and you have to deal with it in the best way that there's some community consensus about on pulling that together. Okay, so let's see. Anyway, quick questions. Anyone about any federal buildings? About actually, great resource. Did I bring it? Come on, Chris. Yeah, I did. Okay, this back in the '80s, there was a whole grand publication run of people that did with architectural books. From my perspective, professionally as well as personally, I think McAllister's book, Field Guide to American Houses, is one of the best books out there. It would not surprise me if this is in digital form today, but if you take this book, put it in your console, get your cup of coffee or tea, bring your kids, you should be able to go anywhere in the United States and give yourself a self-tour. We do this frequently internationally. It's fun. It's interesting to figure out how communities develop, what the major components are. We wouldn't have main streets in Europe. What we have is plazas, and what we have is town squares, and we have a different format of gathering there. So it's a fun thing to do if you have some time and you. Oh, sure, happy, sure. Okay, so let's go. Now we're going to sing the melody or not?
No, well, let's just walk.
Okay, we're gonna.
Oh, this is so hard to do. It's so
Since my baby left me, I got a new place to dwell. Down at the end of Central Street, Mary M. Hotel.
Okay, so this is fun. It's interesting. I actually grew up in Mendon most of my life, Blackstone Valley, the industrial basin, our first industrial basin in the U.S. that's out my backyard. But coming here, there's this interesting main street so this building across the street, if you go to, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 pages in, you'll see 50 Main Street, 1880. Just got a little bit beyond the light. Yeah, there you go.
What the building looks like.
And so there's a couple of things that's interesting about this building. And there's a couple of lessons there and also with the Forbes building. So this building was for tourists, was a hotel. You would drive to Main Street, Westborough, you would stop, and you would get a room for the night and maybe some dinner. If you notice at the bottom of the page, it had a really severe fire. There are several pictures in the library collection. But for most of us, we don't think about fire today, and part of that is, if I put on my building official hat, is because building codes and fire codes have been in place for now almost 50 years. And even though they're complicated and difficult under certain circumstances, they actually do have an effect. And one is we have a lot less fires. And what you will see is, so this building had a severe fire. If you notice on the back, you can still see the sign, and yet you can see the hose is running and all that. And then if you turn the page and look behind us, this is actually the Whitney House Hotel. Again, another place for people driving and riding through Westborough to stop and stay. This said, so originally, a couple of things I wanted to show you this building is if you look at is everyone on this page? Sure. Am I sort of close? Okay.
Whitney.
All right. So second page down. Tell me something about that building that's different than what we see in the Forbes building. What's the most immediate thing that jumps out at you?
Main Street was built right to the sidewalk.
Okay. Right. It's built to the sidewalk. Why? Storefront commercial. Take the guy from Slovakia and give him an extra bump. And look what we have a little further. What's happening with our commercial building? They're being pulled because, one, whether it's walking traffic, buggy traffic, trolley traffic, car traffic, we want the immediacy. What's Main Street on steroids for commercial? Here in Westborough. We even have it in Westborough. What's Main Street on steroids here in Westborough? Route 9. That's it. That's it. The state highway system, specifically the magical mile of just commercial. Go anywhere in the world, I should say anywhere in the United States, not a whole lot different. The only thing different is the design motif. You might have, a saguaro cactus or something rather than something else. Okay, so here's this huge building. I mean, this is a 4-story building. There's no sprinklers. There's no fire detection. Okay, whatever happened, something happened. Serious fire. Interesting photos. see people, you see car on the lower left. It comes down. And then what happens to the site? Well, the Forbes family, who I might look to Chris a little bit. The Forbes family were one of the mercantile / manufacturing entrepreneuring families that we'll talk a lot more about on Church Street, where their house was. But they acted in a paternalistic manner, much as every mill village from Worcester down to Providence did, where certain families would gather a lot of capital based on patenting ideas and also, running an enterprise that had world markets. Because you have to remember, the United States is burgeoning especially after the Civil War. And so here, this land's given, and so now what's interesting about this building is a lot like the bank. So this was built as a school, high school. If anyone's been in it, I think the gymnasium's still there. I don't know it all well. Okay, then it was converted in the 80s, I believe, for partially police and partially for offices. And now the town's going to go through another $22 million reconfiguration to make it even more efficient. And the only thing I can speak to is I know within the, a lot of times, a lot of town boards and stuff have lots of paper. And most of it in this process is being transferred to digital, because guess what? You don't need all that square footage to be saving paper when everything's digital. It doesn't matter what you run. You're an assessor, or you're a tax collector, or you're a building department, or a fire department. So with that, this issue of fire, we're going to see in a preeminent way when we do the July program on Westborough. Because what happens when the train came through in 1830, the churches left because the meeting house is sitting 5 feet from the track, and that's probably not an easy relationship, especially on Sunday. And the town halls are being built to move further away, and on the other side was where all the manufacturing was. So where all this wealth is starting to be generated, where what this is mercantile, that becomes this manufacturing base. But along with it are just these huge fires over and over and over. So let's take a little walk down by the to the front of the story in the town hall. All right, so if you turn to the picture of the Baptist Church, 36 West Main, 1840s, you look. And then if you actually, don't have to look at me, why don't we look at the Baptist Church? So part of this tour is also to show that sometimes you end up with just more questions. So if you look at the early maps in the 1830s, it shows there's a church at this site. What's not clear is what kind of church it is. There is some written documentation, although not all that well crossed with other information, that it might be the Baptist church. Then there's this other sort of layer of information that says there was a fire at that building, and maybe it was from my perspective, one of the primary things I use and sort of train for is to look architecturally at something and know within periods of time the style, space, finishes, fabric, and what it should be. So this is definitely an Italianate building. It's definitely something in the late 50s, 60s, and 70s. We put it here as 40s because again, circa means it's not absolute. And so if you look at this building, the truth of this is if you go to, did we use that?
It's the page before, I think, that has
The spire?
the.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, go to the page before.
Yeah.
So this is why you always need a partner in life. But if you look at the page before, you'll see two historic images. One is of the original town hall, the Greek revival, because remember, this town hall is getting moved about the 1830s, 40s. We can go through some of the features now that's a little warmer. And right next to it is this Baptist church. But if you notice in the Baptist church, it has this really magnificent spire with a bell in it. And of course, if you look out here at the church here, it isn't. It's been truncated with a cupola sort of finish. The bell's still there because if we go to the next page, we know if someone, I guess 7 years ago roughly, it was a Paul Revere bell. We have to remember Paul Revere, besides his famous ride, if anyone comes or works in Canton, I mean, there's the Revere Copper Works. This is an industry that basically he started 100 years ago. And so he did all kinds of things. He did roofing, he did bells, and so here, this bell is then given by the I guess, I'm so cold I can't even speak anymore. An unconsecrated Baptist church was sold to the South Meeting House Church in Boston, which we see, it's being removed out. You can see the Paul Revere on the lower left. And then it's turned over to another great adaptive reuse or historic rehab, meaning the church is converted into this nonprofit. Here we have another great example. Here's the Westborough Savings Bank, the second oldest bank in the town of Westborough. From the outside, you would never know what happened inside, though inside we have this high-tech media center, and whether people have used it or there's great facilities here for taping and recording and such. You would never know that was in this building unless you came in. Secondly, if this, for some reason, Westborough TV decided to leave, guess what? This studio just pops out and leaves, and most of the historic space, because you can read, this is insertion, details like the Mosler lock, the Mosler safe, which someone can, if you want, walk back. All these wonderfully colonial revival arched windows, all the paneling that you're sitting next to, all stay and remain, and then can be reconfigured with something else. If people remember when you came in, you had this was where the office was for the manager, and then you had the teller's booth. And so what they did, I thought, a very clever job is they actually also kept a lot of that woodwork and then just reinstalled it. As you can see, these front things are higher than what they were originally. So back to the Baptist church. So one of the reasons you're looking at that top picture is hurricane. Not only fire, but we also have to remember natural disasters are a major reason that damage happens to buildings. And we can think of Katrina, but we can also think here in New England that hurricanes, whether it's the 38, the 54, are a major source. When we do the tornadoes, sorry. When we do the 1960s O'Neill walk, what was it?
O'Neill Drive, the 60s, Catch the Vibe.
So Touch the Vibe. So this is music that comes right from Elsie's real life as she grew up in the 60s and 70s. But anyway, we're going to look at early suburbia. I mean, we're looking at homes that were built in the 50s and 60s, right after the war. And we'll also take a look at the high school site, because actually that was an estate at one point that was major. It was completely obliterated by the tornado. So we'll follow up on that sometime. I think it's in September. So if we go back to the town hall. So one of the nice things about the town hall is if you look at the historic photo from 1929, so again, we're at the end of the economic boom before we have the Depression, and you look at this photo, one of the things you would do is take a look back and forth and see, is most of the detailing, is most of the facade, meaning that front elevation, is most of the tower and cupola intact? And a quick review says it is. Some of the things that might have changed are like the fire escape you see on the left, and some other things.
Which page are you looking at?
Oh, I'm sorry. This is the page right before.
Are you looking at the historic one or
Old
the?
town hall, you're talking about the old.
Yeah, the old town. No, I'm talking about the old one. Sorry. We on this page here? Yeah. So when you have 20th century imagery, it's actually a lot stronger and more accurate to tell change that has happened within a building. Now the other interesting is, I don't know if anyone was watching why they were doing the $15 million historic rehab a couple of years ago, or town meeting members. Yeah. Is that they actually shifted and changed, and this is sometimes controversial, but personally I think it's reasonable. So on a lot of the cupola and the clock tower part, most of the wood was removed, and mostly that's all PVC. It's a PVC product. It reads white. It's white all the way through. It's actually quite durable. You have to keep an eye on seaming and stuff, but that will have a lot longer lifespan, not of the wood, because the wood could be there for hundreds of years, but of the paint or the applied film that's there to protect the wood. Now, if the applied film had failed, of course, then the wood fails. Well, here we have a way where materials were changed because we have new material technology, and to me, reads and feels very much like it's part of the authentic historic building that's there. Now, okay, so let's see, what else do you want? Okay, I guess we do the commercial blocks. Well, actually, any general questions on either the Baptist Church or the Colonial Revival Town Hall from anyone? Okay. Are you guys all sort of?
Before it was Colonial Revival, what was it?
Oh, it was Greek. The original, I'm sorry, the original one was Greek Revival. You can, if you want, you can, same thing. Look at the columns on that. So if you go back to the page with the 1830-40 Greek Revival, you have a full portico. So portico is when you extend a porch, whether it's 1 story or 2 stories, And it has columns that run the whole length. Again, what's it holding up? It's holding up the pediment, the triangular piece on top. If you think, again, back to the Greek temples, it's pretty much the same. You also see under that, if you look under the left side, that really wide, that's called a frieze board. And again, it's very traditional in a lot of classical design, but specifically in the Greek Revival. And also, if we had a little better, like if we took this image digitally and enhanced those windows, again, they're going to be multi-planes, potentially 12 over 12. You also see up in the cupola the coins. We didn't talk about this, but coins are, again, a classical motif that we saw up at the Congregational Church as part of the classical art detailing there. And we see it here in this historic image of the original town hall.
Does anyone know if that building burned? Do you know?
I don't think it did.
No.
They tore it
They just tore it
down.
down.
Tore it down.
The,
When was
in
that?
the collector's,
20s?
in the collector's office in Town Hall, there's plenty of information about these two buildings.
Okay.
Yeah, right behind the collector's window, there's a couple books on this.
All right, so let's move to the Park Building in the American Block. So directly across us, if you peek under the shade. Now, again, what's really nice about these four-story commercial buildings from the 1870s and 1880s is if you look at the first floor, you see the buildings have been transformed from this residential architecture where you have doors and windows, but basically there's a lot of siding, to a commercial retail presence. So when people come by, they can actually look in and see what's being sold, whether it's dry goods, whether it's clothing. And not only that, the reason they're able to get these large glass openings is two things. One, glass technology has changed, and now we can do these single pane, large spaces. But secondly, if you see each pier on that building, they're all cast iron. So they were actually, those cast iron posts were actually holding a steel beam above that then get veneered in a piece of granite. And so just like we do today with large steel Class A infrastructure, steel allows for these huge spans. So here we see by the 1870s and 80s, it was common enough that even in downtown Westborough, you'd be having these grand openings. What I think is really interesting is frequently these get filled in. They get filled in because of, from my perspective, false concerns about energy. They get filled in because someone thinks that they're too exposed to the public, which is sort of the opposite of what the initial design was. But here, in both cases, they're held to, and you can see the small spandrels at the base, of each one. Now, my understanding on the American Block is the couple that actually own the Brickyard, the Ullman farm on East Main Street. I don't know their names.
Wheatcroft's.
Wheatcroft. Okay. Had bought this. They actually did a historic rehab, meaning there is a 20% federal tax credit and a 10% commercial credit for restoring historic buildings. Actually, the Milk Street, that short span of buildings on Milk Street side were just completed for, I think, $1.9 million last year. The arcade building is in process for both federal and state tax credits now. I believe the historic rehab will go on next year. And it's, when you can get 20, 30 cents on a dollar, if you put your developer's hat on, that's a great incentive, and there isn't much in the IRS code that can match that. So and the reason is it's to do this, is to help people not only stabilize buildings, but deal with, again, fire, access, elevators, egress, et cetera, and also bring some presence so people understand what it might look like 100 years before that. Okay, we flip to the next.
Well, and on that one, the park building.
Oh, the park building. So the park building is what's called the High Victorian Gothic building. That's the one on the right. The one that was not gone through. The one with Page Jewelers is in. And the reason you can tell is if you look above the windows, you'll see these sort of little truncated arches. You'll see the same thing in Corbell's brick when we do around the corner, the
Henry.
Yeah, the Henry building, right where Honeysuckle is. And so with that, that's one of the defining features. The other thing, which we can't see very well, is most of these commercial buildings of 3, 4, 5, 6 stories also have these pretty elaborate parapets. That's the area above the roof system. And so if you look at the park building, it's there, it's present. They even have the corner corbels. When we walk out by the arcade building, One of the things you'll notice is there's a picture in here where the full parapet's there, and then you'll look at the building now and it looks like someone gave it a haircut. And the fact is, it's the same thing as with the library. You know, people don't think these details make a difference, but they do. They're just visually, there are more, they make something more, it's a line. It kind of boxes something in, but it's not a straight line. It's something that actually has some artistic as well as symbolic meaning to it.
Also on the page where the park block and American block pictures are, you can just look in the photo about to the left of what was down there. There's
Oh, that's right.
there's like a
Oh, I'm
house,
sorry,
there's-
right. Okay, so you know the alley between the town hall and the park building? Look what's in the back. When we walk the dog all the time, we're always trying to figure out, like, what's the big parking lot? Like, what was there? Okay, so does anyone want to conjecture a theory of why that 5-bay federal house is sitting behind the park building? And if you had time to look at the maps, you actually probably would again. Pardon me?
The owner, the proprietor.
It could be. It could be. It's like go back to those federal buildings. Think about if that owner had either the capital, the initiative, the public permission, and decided they want to put a commercial building in front of them. I mean, when you look in downtowns all over the country, you see this all the time. Some residential structure that's hardly even definable, and in front of it's this big commercial thing. And as that business or that entity grew, it needed more space. And so it's pulled out to the front, for as you were pointing out, so there's easy access commercially. But also, in this case, I just think it's really fascinating. So if you go back to that parking area, which is necessary, needed, there's probably a whole cluster of these single-family homes that are either federal or Greek that were just there, but before there was lawns that came all the way up to Main Street rather than an actual building.
And to the left is a Greek revival, right?
Yeah.
That's not there anymore.
Right, it's removed, and then this, again, brick structure where the parking in the rear and whatever sign was there, this is to the left side, at the end of the row there.
To the left of the American.
The last, I think it's 3-story. But same thing, it had large glass areas. It's a Beaux-Art. If you see the little red thing, it's sort of this Beaux-Art feel. It also has some Richardsonian, meaning the dark sort of Longmeadow sandstone that you see in the belt courses, or those horizontal lines. I know this is really hard to do in here. Okay. All right, we'll stop. All right, anybody else have, well, it's not, I mean, it's hard to talk about something and there's not a visual reference, and yet it's too cold outside. Okay, any quick questions? Anybody who wants to go see the Mosler lock safe, because that's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And then think of yourself as a bank robber, and tell me what you would do to get in there, I guess, if the tumblers were all set. And no, you can't go kidnap the bank president, bring him down, and ask him to open it up.
You know that it would be untrue. You know that I would be a liar if I were to say to you, girl, we couldn't get much higher. Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire. Try to set the night on fire.
This is another fire story, but we're not in the manufacturing district yet. We're still in the mercantile district. So if you look directly across the street, you see really what is a historic building. If you look up at the corners, again, this is another interesting thing about commercial districts. An awful lot is understood if you look up, and of course most of us we don't. We watch what's in front of us. So if you go to that 123 South Street where it says the current liquor store, this is a beautiful, really well detailed, well proportioned Second Empire building was on that corner. And then, some point between 1870 and 1878, we have what is there now. So if you look at the postcard, you actually get to see what's under that vinyl and the windows that were replaced and the first floor, whatever you want to call it, with the bottled liquor sign. And you get a much greater flavor of if all that was just removed. Because a lot of times when you do historic rehab work, or even restaurant, you're basically just delayering. You're delayering because other people have just found it easier to add. Now, what's funny about this is that's only 8 years. So how do you have this really spectacular building with the Second Empire? You could see all the signs, the bank sign and the Grigg sign, great historic photo, and yet within short order, it's replaced. Now, this is one of these mysteries again. It's like someone just told me about one of the churches was actually elevated. Oh, I know, the Congo church someone was mentioning was actually elevated as part of the major 1869 historic rehab, although they didn't call it historic rehabs back then. And so the fact is, with all these, there's a lot more time and energy needed to get sort of to the bottom. But to me, I would interpret this, and it's only interpretation, is you don't lose a major commercial building in 7 years unless there's a fire. Because no one, like today, just usually takes a building, destroys it to build something, even if they get another story out of it. And this, you're not even getting. This is a 3-story building. That Second Empire building is a 3-story building. You're not even getting more square footage for rental income. So it's like, what's happening here? So if anyone or their children within the school system, there's lots of places for good projects here for people to do more research. And it's just really, it's one, I think Tony would agree, it's a time thing. It's fun. It's like a mystery. It's like a puzzle, but it takes some time. Sometimes you need some professional guidance on what you're looking at and why you're looking at it. But it's really something that's fairly straightforward, and it's sort of a fun thing. Just the other quick note to the right, you can see in the lower level here, again, this Greek Revival wood building that LC was talking about. But here what we see is a brick veneer. This is, again, a colonial revival, the brown sort of, that's a typical color for masonry, brick masonry in the 20s. And again, it's 3 stories, it's apartments, it's a mixed use. This is the other major message about downtown. Most of these buildings have some kind of mixed use. It's not just commercial, it's not just office, it's not just retail, it's not just housing. And that was historically true until we come to after World War II. And then most of suburbia says, nope, houses over there, industry over there, commercial there. And the problem is, for a viable downtown, a viable main street, a viable village, you need the mixed use. That's what makes us actually happy as humans. And that there's been lots of different studies from different points, psychology, sociology, architectural, urban planning, that basically prove that well. The other notation, well, actually, we'll wait till we go across the street. Okay, as a group of 30, we're ready to make the big.
Is there? It seems so. The building itself is so plain, and then
Well,
there's this big ornate thing at the top.
So there's the ornate thing. See the brackets?
Yeah.
Those brackets are the exact same. Those are Italianate brackets.
Yeah.
Okay, this is all covered. They change all the windows. They denude. It's what we call in our profession denuding. Denuding is when you strip out all the details and all the architectural statements, and you make it a box. Because remember, every building is a box. That's all it is. And boxes sometimes, and boxes alone, boxes high, boxes low, but they're basically a box. And so it's only the architectural detail. America has about 110 styles, and it's only really the detail, as well as sometimes the floor plans and layouts, that you understand what stylistically something's
So they
coming
just
out.
didn't like the ornate stuff anymore?
Either they
so
didn't
made
like it,
plain?
there were major leak. So here, if I was to guess, major leaking problems, water's coming in, energy efficiency. Don't know.
It costs too much to fix it, costs too much to maintain it.
Oh,
it's covered
the
with
last 30
vinyl
years,
and-
most likely. That's vinyl siding. It's been around since the late 70s, 80s. So, recent. Is it irreversible? No. If someone really wanted to, this lower picture, that building could easily be put back with a historic tax project to deal with that if someone thought and found justification in the performer to do that.
So it's under there. It's under
Well,
the vinyl.
the box is under there. I don't know. It's like, think about it this way, Elaine. If you take off your glasses and you take off your earring, well, you're sort of denuding yourself a little bit. Do you look different with them and without? Probably. So it's kind of the same thing with the building. So it depends on. I would suspect when you took that off, what you'd have is just a board, matchboard
A wooden
underside.
box.
Yeah, a wooden box underneath with a substrate. I mean, what we would call it. And you wouldn't have much of anything, unfortunately. But you could recreate it. This is the other nice thing about photos, and I will say another nice. Westborough should be actually accoladed for the quality, at least so far. I mean, actually, still have to go through our own Historic Society archives, but they have a really strong photographic resource here. I mean, a lot of times when we do work, it is really hard to get. And if you want to take a project and make it feel right, a little bit like what we're going to talk next door here at 25, it really helps to have historic photos at different points in time, so you have some feel and sense.
Another talk we were at in Westborough, because there were several photographers.
Oh, that could be.
Westborough,
Okay.
And that's why there is such a plethora.
But they also, it's not only having them, because those studios on here, but then someone has to keep them.
Right.
Someone has to give them or donate them. Go one picture back to the arcade building. Now, both these pictures aren't that old. I mean, whoever has it. Both these pictures aren't that old. I mean, you see the bicycles, probably maybe from the 40s is the top one. And later on, maybe we're in the 60s or something. So what's interesting about these is, again, look up where the parapet is. Look up above all that corbelled, brick, sort of the bracketing, what it looks like. Look above where it says the arcade building, the 1890, that's, in the Long Meadow sandstone. And you notice it looks flat. It looks kind of unterminated. Now, wouldn't it be nicer, or at least I think it would, if that parapet was actually over the middle, so you knew what was center. You knew what the center of the building was. You knew that it's a symmetrical building. The left side is equal to the right side. The other thing to notice when you deal with commercial properties is signage. We didn't really talk much about that, but it's fascinating because signage tells us something about what kind of offerings for services and for products. The other thing that's really interesting about signage is, my brain just froze.
Along with the rest of you.
Is that, I'm sorry, the maps we were referencing, the later you get into the 19th century, the more of them, if you look at the full map, now remember, we only did little snippets, if you look at the full map, you'll see businesses listed with the addresses of proprietors of like the law firm, and so it's a great way to understand what kind of services and product, because those are usually the two things we do here, are there. Now the other, I want to just accolade this. So this I think is a tribute to the developer, to the owner record, to the developer, to the, we have a design review district down the commercial area. And so if you look at 25, so if you go to the page before, excuse me, and you look at 25 West Main, and you look at the top picture, we see where it says post office block. Okay, so this was a 3-story Second Empire building from the 1870s. I don't know if people have been here long enough. I think when I first came here 9 years ago, this building that we're seeing in the picture, not what we're seeing on site, they had the whole 3rd floor lopped off. Have no idea why. A lot of times people, again, because fire reasons, access reasons, they just take the floor off. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to upgrade the building, and they'd rather lose the square footage. They might have owned it for a long period of time. Maybe the mortgages are paid off. They use it as a loss tax write-off. But here, what we see is in its full glory, what it really is in a nicely proportioned building.
In the top photo.
On the top photo. On the bottom photo, we see it a little more contemporary because we also see the bank. We know the bank's there for 1929. If we look at the cars, what do we think? 60s, maybe?
Yeah.
50, late 50s, 60s, something. Yeah. So again, there's another clue. The kind of cars we're seeing tells us a little bit about time. But again, that building is sort of still there. And then if you remember, 2 stories, it was covered with a sort of a pebbles, stucco, and and this is what happened in the 60s and 70s. People just went for these veneer quick fixes. They just wanted to kind of look new and sparky because they've been fighting through the 50s and 60s trying to get some sort of economic energy back. All right, so here's a building that was done 2 years ago. They're looking, I think Daniel Collins out of Northborough was the architect, if I remember. I don't know the developer.
They did a great job.
But it seems to me this is a really nice, what I would call reproduction. It uses the language. You can tell it's modern, but it reads fine. And I know, I'd take a quick poll. What do we read?
Very good.
Reads fine or no? Yes or no?
Yes.
Oh, no.
Good job. They did.
Okay,
All
so
right.
whoever's on the design review, oh, my dear's saying, quick, let's go eat. All right, last thing as we go down. Last page.
We just to get out of the wind.
Yeah, the wind. Okay. Okay, last page. Come on out to the speed bump. That's what these are. They're made so people slow down. They're made so they define parking, so people aren't quite supposedly backing into each other quite so much. Okay, so we had the central block to the right with what I guess most everyone knows is the Westborough package store. And this is the Henry block, and this wraps around. And so again, what do we see? We see this really funny sequence. So the top photo is from the 1870s. It's a Second Empire building. It's just like the one we saw on the right. And then yet, within 10 years, we're looking at what we're seeing. So what happened to that original building? They're both next to each other. These are wood frame buildings, meaning the Second Empire. They're all wood frame structure. Is there a fire? I don't know. It seems to me it's a really interesting, important question. Somewhere, there's got to be primary and even secondary source material to sort that out. Or maybe you know. I don't. Anyone from the Westborough Fire Department? The fact of the matter is, I can speak for the building side of that pair. building records are really varied. Some towns are really great, like in Wellesley where I can go back to 1925 when I was there, zoning and building, and guess what? Almost everything's there. I can go to another town, they don't have from 2 years ago. Now, I'm not saying that's public records, they're doing it right. All I'm saying is, so I can't speak for the Westborough Fire Department, maybe not, but it's a good place to potentially for someone to look.
Phil Kittredge.
And actually, I guess we have an ex-fire chief, is it? Yeah, Phil.
Fireman.
Well,
Phil Kittredge.
Fireman, okay, who's going to do one of the lectures, and so I guess he would have probably the best insight of that of all. So anyway, here we are. We're in an Italianate building. See all those nice corbelled arches over every window? See, every window is that's called a segmental window or segmental arch window. See how the whole veneer of the front has all this sort of attenuation of brick in and out, in and out, in and out. And then there's the string horses that sort of act as sills, but they also tell you roughly that the floor levels, within a couple feet of it all. If we come down to the first floor, what do we have? We have cast iron columns, so like Nicolina's and Ferris Flowers, and then besides those are these granite veneered columns, probably with cast iron thing, holding up a steel beam, or wrought iron beam, depending, probably actually wrought iron most likely, for opening the legs. And so, yeah, we're actually getting ready to go to Mount Everest next year.
That would be the day.
Okay. And then the last thing is, and now again, there's we could do a whole walking tour just on storefronts, retail and office. But if you look here, same thing. Look at the original storefronts and signage. Look at the stuff from the 1960s, the storefront, and then look at now. They elicit different responses. Do you want to go in? Do you not want to go in? Do you pass them by? Is it more about the product? Is it more about the service? Is it more about how it looks and feels? If you're here as a resident, one of the things that Elsie and I love is we can walk the whole day. One of the reasons we're here, we can walk all of it. We can walk to Roaches, we can walk downtown. For us to live out our life here, it makes sense. For others passing through, they might have to catch someone's eye if they're coming up from Mendon or Upton or over by Hoppington to say, come visit, look at my flower display. So anyway, all those things are actually usually conscious and usually are made. The other nice thing is even the double entry door is an Italianate door. That's the original door set. It's missing one of its, in its panel, it's missing one of its blocks on the left, but still it's there, and see the large glass transom above it. So that's, from my perspective, that's what's nice, is that there's a lot of authentic material, authentic space and openings, and I've never been upstairs, so I don't know what the floor plans are like, and I don't know what the interior finishes are like, but on the exterior, it's really well. Also, if you look at the very, very top, see how it's basically, instead of having a pediment, it has an extended cornice, which is great. It gives some closure there. You're not just looking up straight to the sky. And also, it helps in a technical way. It helps keep rain and snow off the facade, at least immediately. It doesn't mean it can't. And hopefully going back, if it's pitched right, to some drain system out. Okay, anyone? Last question before we go have a little snack. Anything? Okay, sounds great. So everyone, say thank you to the Westborough Historic Society, and we'll meet you over at things. Okay.
The 100th town in its 300th year is raising a toast with pride and good cheer for all that we are, for all we will be, for our vibrant and deep and rich history. In 1717 years, 27 families lived here. On the day of 18 in the month of November, though none of us here was alive to remember, something occurred for us all beneficial. The Western Borough as a town was official. Of course it began many thousands of years before humans like us and our ilk all appeared. Long before sleighs, long before shoes, our ancestors paddled in dugout canoes on rivers that we now enjoy in our leisure. Their source of survival, now our source of pleasure. The 100th town in its 300th year is raising a toast with pride and good cheer for all that we are, for all we will be, for our vibrant and deep and rich history. The town's citizens in those earliest days weren't from around here, they came a long way, embraced a new life and a new land unseen, arrived by the power of wind and of dreams. Some ended up fighting the country they fled. We're the United States on the blood that they shed. True revolution has many a face. It's not only war that changes a place. Industrial growth touched this small farming town, which over the years has seen ups and seen downs, has grown and has prospered, has struggled and won. And we are a part of all it's become. The 100th town in its 300th year is raising a toast with pride and good cheer, for all that we are, for all we will be, for our vibrant and deep and rich history. So that brings us here to this day in the present, to a town that is thriving and pretty and pleasant. A rich tapestry in our midst has unfurled, made with neighbors that come from all parts of the world. We're techies and truckers, we're teachers and more, all of us touched by who came here before. The 100th town in its 300th year is raising a toast with pride and good cheer, for all that we are, for all we will be, for our vibrant and deep and rich history. For our vibrant and deep and rich history.